Hello and welcome again to the Christ Baptist Church devotional as we're making our way through the book of Genesis. We've now gone through Genesis 1 all the way through Genesis 10. And we're almost through the first 11 chapters of Genesis, which is a really fascinating account of the creation of the earth and the development of culture and humankind. And we're going to get one very in particular point in particular here today is going to be language. Where did language come from? And how did that all work and come to bear? But there's actually a bigger theme that's going to come out here as we deal with Genesis chapter 11 and just a little bit of chapter 12 to really make the point. And it's the idea of fame. You know, we all like fame. We all like to be famous. We all like to have an important name. We all really enjoy the praise of people. Well, we're going to have a very important lesson on that here in Genesis 11 that God speaks to us here. And in particular, though, it's going to also give us a lesson of the history of actually language and where that all happened and where that came from. So if you've got your Bibles, we're in Genesis chapter 11. We've covered all the way up through the flood and then what happened after the flood and God fulfilling his promise and fulfilling out the nations, how they all happened. But as we saw, it's not, he put them in Africa and South America, and those places didn't exist. It was one big land mass, one big solid land mass that was taking place, and all the people were on that. And they were kind of together by their tribes. How did that work? Well, we're going to find out. Follow along here as we're in Genesis chapter 11, verse 1. Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. How about that right there? Right there in verse 1. The whole earth, everybody on the earth. It makes sense. We're not that far, but actually we're about 1,000 years. If we did the mathematics, we'd be about 1,000 years, or probably more, 1,000 years after the flood, and we start getting into generations then. And really, we want to point out, I'll just tell you right now, this 11 verse 1 is about only 100 to 120 years after the flood. That's all. Not a long time after the flood. And I'm going to show you how we get there. But it's been about 1,000 years since Adam coming, and now it's only been about 100 years after the flood, the great flood that killed everybody. So now these are the people who came down through all the fathers and sons and grandchildren and so forth that went on through the earth. And it makes sense that out of Shem, Ham, and Japheth coming out of the boat, everybody spoke the same language as Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They all had the same language. That's what we see. The whole earth used the same language, the same words. Verse 2, it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Now that should trigger something in your mind. The land of Shinar. Where have we seen that before? Well, back in chapter 10, under a man named Nimrod in chapter 10, verse 10, the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. So this is basically talking about the kingdom that Nimrod began to set up. And Nimrod really is the son of Cush, and Cush is actually a brother of Canaan and a son of Ham. So we're really only talking not many generations after here that comes in. And Nimrod had to grow up and form this kingdom in the land of Shinar. So we now put us in this area that's not too far removed from Ham. Ham, Canaan, and his brother was Cush, and Cush had Nimrod. That's what Genesis chapter 10 tells us. Cush became the father of Nimrod. So we see that in there as in the time frame. It's pretty close to the flood. So they all spoke the same language. They journeyed east in the plain there. But this is what they said. They said to one another, "Come, let us bake bricks, burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. So it just tells us they said, let's bake bricks. Now, why did they want to make these bricks? Is it because they saw good industry there, good commerce, making bricks? We know Cain's family in the old days, they were making iron Well, they said, let's make bricks. But here's what they wanted in verse 4. They said, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise, we'll be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. They want to make for themselves a name. They want to make a name for themselves. They want to be proud. They want to be famous. They want to say, we are exalted. And they can use bricks to make a tower as high as what they say will reach into heaven. We can become supernatural again. We can do all of this. We essentially are the ones to be worshipped. So the point is, they were wanting to become famous. They wanted to say, we do it ourselves. And so they were excited about building a city and a tower and all of that that'll make that happen. That's Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Remember, I said it's not a good thing. He said, I'm mighty, I'm mightier than everybody else. I can conquer everybody else. So they started building. And off they go. They're building this city and trying to build the tallest tower, try to, make like the hotel in Dubai, 120 stories. They're trying to make this thing tall. Verse 5, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. Well, it's not like the Lord couldn't see from where he was in heaven and had to come down and see. And that's a figure of speech. It says he got very close to really examine the heart of this sin. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. So he's noticing they're all unified in their sin. They're unified in their sin. They're having a sinful nature. They deny God. They're running away from God, and they're unifying on their denial of God. So they're one people, have one language, and this is what they want to do. And if they accomplish this, then they'll say there's nothing that can happen. We have achieved everything, and they'll never listen to the voice of the Lord. So verse 7, here's what we see here. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language. Did you see that right there? Let us go down. Isn't that interesting? Right there in Genesis, we see let us. Not let me go down. Let us. Which says there's more than one in the Godhead here. That's what we understand. Let us go down. There's a Trinity. We know this. So let us go down there and confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. He didn't stop their language. He confused it. You see, God didn't have to give new ways of speaking to people. Because why? Grammar, which is how language is constructed, was given to Adam from the beginning, different than animals. Adam had a sense of grammar. He had a way to command. He had a way to give a question. He had a way to give a condition. He had a subject, a verb, an object, all that. That is hardwired into the human DNA. Grammar. We use it to speak. Babies, if they're never even taught how to speak, they begin to form their language in that way. Babies can communicate when they grow older. They don't need to go to school to learn, this is how I'm going to speak. They already speak. So when they go to school and learn grammar, they're already using it and speaking. So the grammar classes are just telling them how we've defined what they're already doing. So people had grammar. God didn't give them new grammar. He gave them new words. Let us confuse their language so that now we have different dialects, different tones, completely different. We don't even know what the mother language was. But we do know that he confused their languages, so when they wake up one morning, they go to build something, and one says, hey, can you hand me that brick? Well, what he said, the other guy's language was, can you hit that guy in the hand with a hammer? And so we can imagine all kinds of problems were happening in this construction. I mean, stuff was not getting delivered. Stuff was everywhere. People were dumping stuff all over the place. People were told to go home. They didn't know it. They couldn't understand each other. And so what happened was, verse 8, So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. So the Lord, as a means of judgment, was also a means of grace. What do I mean by grace? He broke the people's unity because they were unifying on sin. They were unifying on their pride to make a name for themselves. And he broke that up. That's grace. And by doing that in language, now everybody is not relating to each other. They don't understand each other. And now they don't like each other because they're different. And what happened is people are starting to neutralize each other. And basically evil is checked by other people. See? And that way it's not going to gain total power. The only time we're going to see really a single world ruler is when we get to the Antichrist, all the way to the book of Revelation, the ultimate power. Why? When the world unifies on one person. See, that's unifying on sin. That's the one damage we can all have when we unify on sin. Well, God made it so we couldn't. But it was also a judgment because he said, look what you're doing. I'm going to make it very difficult for you. It was already difficult farming. Thorns and thistles come up and pregnancy is difficult. Now it's even more difficult. You can't communicate. I mean, you'll have to get translators. It's going to be difficult. So people are going to have to go learn another language and take that time. And, it's going to go slow. It's going to go slow. God slowed the human race down by forcing language in. Some languages are closer together than others. It depends on where the clans were and how they were. So he stopped them building. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. So it's called Babel. We saw that again in Genesis chapter 10, and we see that in verse 10, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. So that's Nimrod's claim to fame. He built a city and made everybody not understand each other. Nimrod is responsible for all of us now being confused. That's why I grew up a Nimrod as a person who is just, he's really duff. Because he makes everything confusing. Well, that's Nimrod. Nimrod built a city, and because of Nimrod, now we all don't understand each other. And that's what happened there in the Tower of Babel, chapter 11, verses 1 to 9. So that's a key thing. Where did language finally come from? Where all the different languages come from? It's answered right here. And it was a judgment. It was a judgment, but their grace was so that evil will never unify. And this now brings us to the rest of chapter 11, which is really the genealogy of Shem. And they saved that for the last. And this is where we're also going to find out the timing a bit of when the Tower of Babel happened. In verse 10, these are the records of the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and became the father of Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. So now there's the records of Shem and his whole family. And he had his first child 2 years after the flood. So 2 years after they came off the boat, Shem and Mrs. Shem, they had a baby, and his name was Arphaxad. And he was born 2 years after the flood. And we also know, and make this note because it's going to come back in a second, is that Shem lived 500 years after he became the father of Arphaxad. And he had other sons and daughters. No doubt, had a big family, a lot of other sons and daughters. But after having Arphaxad, he lived 500 more years. So he was alive for 500 more years. Well, what we see here is this now group of sons that came. Arphaxad was born 2 years after the flood. And we see in verse 12 that he lived 35 years and became the father of Shelah. And then he went on and lived another 403 years after he became the father of Shelah, and he had other sons and daughters. And then Shelah lived 30 years and became the father of Eber, or Eber. And Shelah lived 403 years after he became the father of Eber, and he had other sons and daughters. Now, what's important about Eber is that Eber had Peleg, and we see that next in verse 16. He lived 34 years and became the father of Peleg. Why is Peleg important? Chapter 10, verse 25. 2 sons were born to Eber. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days, the earth was divided. The word Peleg in Hebrew means division. So the earth was divided up from one big continent to now a bunch of continents as the continental drift now happened, and things now moved after the flood. All that geological tension was there, and these continents drifted apart. If you were to take a look at the earth and see how the continents are formed, you see that if you actually kind of pull them together, they fit. They all kind of fit like they used to be together in that way. Well, that's continental drift that happened that way. And if we add up the years, it was 2 years after he got off the boat that he made Arphaxad, Arphaxad. And then after that, there was 35 years. Then he had Shelah. Well, that's 37 years. After that, Shelah had 30 years to make Eber, and that's 67 years. And after Eber was born, he lived 34 years. That's 101 years before Peleg was born. That puts it right about the same time as Ham, Cush, Nimrod, and then Nimrod went and found the city of Shinar and all of that. All that lifespan took place. It's only about 101 years for when Peleg was born. And Peleg also, he lived 30 years, verse 18 tells us, and then he went on and lived 209 years. So 239 plus 101, knowing my math, is maximum 340. 340 years. And I believe that would be the number from 101. So that's not a very long time frame after the flood. As a matter of fact, if we know that the continental drift happened when Babel happened here, that basically, let's see, from 239, so 340 maximum, 101, somewhere in there. Shem was still alive. Shem was still alive when the Tower of Babel happened. If there's anybody who could have set him straight, it would have been Shem. He would have said, wait a minute, I was there at the flood. There is a God, and he judges. What happened? Why wouldn't Shem have stopped this? Not to mention Arphaxad, who was born 2 years after the flood, saying, where's all the people? Well, it shows you the heart of man, doesn't it? Right there. It was only between 1 and 300 years. I'd say we could peg it right about 150 years after the flood, maximum 200 probably, after the flood, is when the continental drift started happening and people started to move. Because why? The Tower of Babel had already happened. So the Tower of Babel was only about between 1 and 200 years after the flood. Well, after Peleg, he had someone named Ru. Ru had someone named Serug. Serug had someone named Nahor. And now we're starting to get to something real pertinent too. In verse 24, Nahor lived 29 years and became the father of Terah. And Nahor lived 119 years after he became the father of Terah, and he had other sons and daughters. So he only lived really about 140 years. Boy, we really have come down, haven't we? What did God say? His years shall only be 120. So it's coming down. And then we have Terah. What do we know about Terah? Terah lived 70 years, became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So we know now that the first time right here we see Abram. And he had his brothers Nahor and Haran, and Terah was their father. So it's really not that far off from the flood, is it? Not that far off from the flood. And then we get verse 27. Now these are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor and Haran became the father of Lot. We can pick this up in the next devotion, but I want to show you something here and talk about fame. And then we'll just get into the life of Abram as we go from verse 27. But we see here now, Terah was born and he became the father of Abram. What do we know about Abram? I'm going to read you a verse here in Joshua chapter 24 that will find it fascinating. That Joshua chapter 24, Joshua is explaining to the people about where they've come from. In Joshua 24 verse 2, Joshua said to all the people, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river, namely Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. They served other gods. Joshua 24, verse 2, telling us that Terah, the father of Abraham, and Abraham served other gods. It's only been hundreds of years after the great flood. The boat was still accessible. You could walk up and see it. And they served other gods. Can you believe that? That kind of idolatry? But here's what I want you to see, the big thing for our devotional lesson today about fame. In Genesis chapter 12, the Lord said to Abram, what's he doing talking to Abram? Abram serves other gods. Abram serves other gods. And he says, go forth from your country, from your relatives, from your father's house, to the land which I'll show you, and I'll make you a great nation. I will bless you, and get this, and make your name great. God took an idolater, a man worshiping idols, and just took him and said, I am going to make your name great. You're not going to make your name great. I will. And I'm going to do it by starting with an idolater, one who worships idols. What did Nimrod do? He said, we're going to make our name great. We're going to build a big city. We're going to do all kinds of things. God says, watch what I do. I'll just make you all speak different, and it's confusion. You will not make your name great. God will make sure there's no person will ever make his name great. He tries to make his name great. There was a man who was considered one of the best minds of aviation, meaning flying ever. His name was Howard Hughes. He's going to make his name great, become the greatest man ever. God says, I'm the one who makes man's mind. And he turned him into a recluse, and he died just literally alone, not famous, really, even though he was the wealthiest man, brilliant aviation. God says, no, you're not going to make your name great. Not at all. I will cause you to fall because I make you great, and I start with who you really are, which is an idolater. And then I will give you faith, and I will cause you to believe, and you'll be the father all the way up to the Messiah. Because, again, what's the key to Genesis? What's the key to knowing Genesis? Where's the seed? Where is that seed? Well, we've known it's with Shem, don't we? We see the Tower of Babel, all kinds of nonsense. People split all over the earth. God scattered the earth with people. Where's the seed? Right here with Shem, tucked nice and safely away. Through this line of people, Eber, Peleg, all the way on down to Terah and Abram. And then God starts to work. After we've got culture established, the line is purified, the Nephilim are cleared from the earth, and God's now going to work. And he begins with an idolater and says, I will make your name great. So the lesson here, how do we get famous? Let's let God make us famous and raise us up as we seek to do his will and bless him and worship him in how he made us so that we can be the best we can be in whatever we are, and he will make your name great. We don't make our name great. We don't establish anything. That's what we learn from the Tower of Babel all the way down to Abram. Idolaters that God makes great. We'll see it on the next devotion, Genesis chapter 12.